The contract was signed in blood. Literally. Vickie's brother Ronan dragged his claws across his palm, letting crimson drip onto the parchment like tears he'd never shed. The Western Pack's emissary watched with vulpine amusement as Ronan sealed the deal. His own sister, the wolfless shame of the North Pack, traded for territory and gold. Vickie stood, shackled in silver chains that burned where they touched her bare shoulders, her amber eyes fixed on her brother's face, waiting, praying for some flicker of regret. There was none, only ambition, cold and merciless. "She's yours," Ronan said, not meeting her gaze. "Take her before I change my mind." In that moment, as the Western Pack's warriors closed around her and began dragging her toward the transport cage, Vickie understood the most devastating truth of her life. Family was a luxury the wolfless could never afford. She was currency, disposable, forgotten before she even left. The chains sang a metallic song as they cut into Vickie's wrists, a sound she'd come to recognize as the soundtrack of her powerlessness. She knelt in the cold stone courtyard of her former home, the North Pack's fortress, all grey granite and iron brutality, and watched her brother's silhouette disappear behind the obsidian doors. Ronan wouldn't say goodbye. He'd never acknowledged her as a sister, anyway. Her father had died defending Pack territory 5 winters ago. The moment the funeral pyre ceased smoking, Ronan claimed the Alpha title and everything it promised: dominion, respect, the primal satisfaction of ruling through strength. He'd inherited a wolfless sister too, an accident of birth that had become his great humiliation. Vickie had spent years trying to make herself smaller, quieter, useful in ways that didn't require the transformation she could never achieve. She'd failed. The Western Pack's delegation was larger than protocol demanded. 7 massive warriors, all with the predatory grace that came from successful shifts, muscles corded like rope beneath honeyed skin. Their alpha, a scarred beast named Thorn, had come himself. He stood before Ronan now, reading the contract with eyes like molten amber, nodding at whatever transaction had been brokered. Territory, resources, the North Pack gained a buffer against the coastal raider clans, and Ronan gained the satisfaction of removing his greatest weakness. "The price is acceptable." Ronan's voice carried the hollow pride of a man convincing himself he'd done something necessary, not something monstrous. Thorn smiled, revealing teeth too sharp to be entirely human. The rumors of her scent alone made the journey worthwhile. A human-born female, untouched by the wolf's curse, yet living among shifters. He inhaled deeply, and Vickie felt her stomach lurch as his eyes found hers across the courtyard. Exquisite. Heat crawled up her neck. She understood with sickening clarity what kind of value she held for men like Thorn. Not as a sister, not as a person, as a curiosity. A prize. Her unmarked humanity in a world of fangs and claws made her a peculiar trophy. "She's docile," Ronan said, the lie sitting heavy in the air. "Trained to obey." Vickie kept her head down, let him believe it. The truth, that the only reason she'd survived this long was because she'd perfected the art of invisible resistance, would only make him angrier. Pride was her brother's greatest weakness and strongest addiction. Challenge it, and he'd prove his dominance through whatever violence he could justify. The chains bit deeper as Thorn's warriors hauled her to her feet. One of them, a warrior with a scar that bisected his temple, gripped her upper arm with enough force that she felt bones shift beneath the pressure. She didn't cry out. Tears were another luxury the wolfless couldn't afford. They only invited more cruelty. "The cage?" Thorn gestured toward the black iron transport cart waiting at the courtyard's edge. Better to keep her restrained during travel, Ronan agreed. She's never left the fortress. Might bolt. Another lie. Vickie had never left because she'd had nowhere to go, no pack that wanted her, no future that extended beyond these cold walls. She'd tried to make peace with that small, suffocating life. She'd read in the restricted archives. She'd tended the fortress gardens in secret, finding solace in things that grew without need for the wolf's strength. She'd written poetry no one would ever read, and dreamed of mountains she'd never climb. And now she was being traded like breeding stock to an enemy pack, a fate that had only made sense in her nightmares. The cart's interior was all rust and cramped darkness. Vickie stumbled forward, her bare feet bleeding from the courtyard's sharp stones, and they shoved her inside. The silver chains ran through bolts in the floor. When they locked them down, she found herself in a position barely allowing her to sit upright. Through the iron bars, she watched Ronan's fortress recede as the cart lurched into motion. Her brother never appeared to watch her departure. The journey took 3 days, and during those endless hours of rocking, of grinding wheels on dirt roads, of the acrid stench of fear sweat soaking into her skin, Vickie made herself a promise. She would survive this. Not for Ronan, who'd sold her. Not for any pack that might claim her, but for the small, stubborn flame of herself that refused to be extinguished. She touched the chain around her wrist, cold iron and burning silver, and it felt almost like an anchor. Something solid in a world determined to prove she had no weight, no worth, no anchor of her own. The landscape beyond the bars shifted from the grey-brown forests of the north to something greener, wilder. She could smell the difference in the air. Pine and earth and something else. Something like power, ancient and deep and old as stone. The Western Pack's territory smelled like the heart of the world. The Western Pack's fortress rose from the forest like something that had grown there, not been built. Towers of pale stone reached toward a bruised sky, connected by walls carved directly from cliff face, appearing almost organic in their asymmetry. Vickie's breath caught despite herself. Even in captivity, in chains, approaching what she'd been sold to, the fortress was magnificent. Thorn's pack descended upon their return, like wolves, welcoming home a successful hunt. Warriors emerged from archways, from the courtyards, from the high ramparts, their golden and silver eyes tracking the transport with feral interest. Vickie tried to make herself invisible, a skill she'd perfected over 19 winters, but she could feel the weight of their attention, like hands pressing against her skin. The cart shuddered to a halt in a massive courtyard, and immediately the warriors began shouting orders in the low, rumbling dialect of the Western Territories. Thorn appeared at the cart's door, chain keys jingling in one massive hand. His scar caught the late afternoon light like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. "Bring her to the holding cells," he commanded, his voice carrying the particular authority of an alpha, a sonic frequency that seemed to resonate in the bones themselves, making resistance feel like swimming against an undertow. "Have the healers examine her. I want a full report on her condition before she's assigned quarters." Assigned quarters. The clinical language of that phrasing made something in Vickie's chest tighten with dread. They meant to keep her, then to integrate her into pack life, to transform her into whatever use Thorn had envisioned when he'd negotiated her purchase. The holding cells existed beneath the fortress, accessed through passages carved into living stone. Vickie's feet found every sharp edge, every uneven surface, as the warriors dragged her deeper into shadow. The silver chains had burned through the outer layers of her skin. Beneath them, red welts wept a clear fluid that made her lightheaded. Blood loss, infection risk, the practical consequences of her situation pressed against her consciousness like water filling a drowning room. The cells were cleaner than she'd expected. Stone floors swept clear, straw pallets in each iron-barred enclosure, even a crude iron pot for sanitation. This wasn't a dungeon designed to break spirits. It was a kennel, a place for valuable animals. They removed the transport chains and fastened her to the wall with fresh silver, the metal sizzling against her skin as they locked it into place. One warrior, younger with kinder eyes, brought her water and dried meat. He set it within arm's reach, careful not to meet her gaze, and something about his carefulness suggested he felt shame for what was being done to her. "The Alpha will likely want an heir," a healer said, arriving with herbs and bandages. She was old, her silver hair braided with thin leather cords, her eyes pale as moonlight. "If she carries Thorn's mark, her value increases. We should ensure she's healthy enough to bear." The words landed in Vickie's gut like stones. She understood, with crystalline clarity, that her purpose here wasn't mystery. She was to be bred, used as a vessel for Thorn's line, a wolfless woman in a pack that prided itself on pure shifter blood, a scandal and a curiosity all at once. The healer cleaned her wounds with practiced efficiency, and Vickie noticed she didn't use the rough scrubbing technique that would normally accompany such treatment. Instead, her touch was almost reverent, as though she recognized something in Vickie's brokenness that demanded gentleness. "Your brother," the healer said quietly, her words meant only for Vickie's ears, "made a grave mistake." "Many people make grave mistakes regarding me," Vickie replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm accustomed to being an error in judgment." The healer's pale eyes studied her for a long moment. "You have not yet met the Alpha King." "There is an Alpha King." "Lord Stanley," the healer said, her voice dropping to something like reverence. "He rules the unified Western Territories. Thorn answers to him, as all Alphas here do. The territories are vast, and Stanley keeps his seat in the northern fortress, deep in the Blackthorn Mountains. He rarely visits this settlement." The distinction mattered, Vickie supposed. Thorn would have direct power over her life. This distant Alpha King was merely myth and structure, something abstract in the distance. She filed the information away without understanding why it felt important. The healer finished wrapping her wounds and gathered her supplies. As she stood to leave, she paused, turning back with an expression Vickie couldn't read. "The Alpha King hasn't taken a mate," the healer said, each word carefully placed. "Despite the many offered to him. Despite the many who would cleave to him entirely. For 3 winters, he has refused every proposal, every courtship, every arrangement." She paused. "Until yesterday, when a portrait arrived from the North Pack." Vickie's breath caught. A portrait? Of a girl with amber eyes and dark hair like a starless night. The portrait said to be your likeness, sent by your brother to establish... The healer's voice wavered slightly. "To establish negotiations. I don't understand." "No," the healer agreed softly. "But he does. The Alpha King does. That portrait was painted from his dreams, child. He has dreamed of your face for 3 winters, and now you are here, and he doesn't yet know." The healer left before Vickie could respond, leaving her alone in the stone cell with only the weight of impossible words for company. Vickie didn't sleep for 2 days. She couldn't. The healer's words had infected her mind like a fever, the revelation playing on endless rotation. The Alpha King had dreamed of her face. 3 winters of dreams, of phantom recognitions, of recognizing something in the darkness that his waking mind couldn't explain. It made no sense. She'd never met Stanley. She'd never left the North Pack's territory. They'd had no point of contact, no thread connecting them across the distance. Yet the healer's certainty had carried the weight of absolute truth. Shifters didn't lie about matters of the soul. The mystical connection between fated pairs was one of the pack's most fundamental truths, documented in their oldest histories, woven through their mythology and lore. But Vickie was wolfless. She couldn't be fated to anyone. Fated bonds required the spiritual entanglement between two wolves, the recognition of one's other half, through the pack connection itself. A wolfless human like her existed outside that mystical framework entirely. She was spiritually empty, packless, untouchable by the forces that governed shifter existence. On the third morning, everything changed. The fortress shook, literally shook, a tremor that loosened mortar from the stones and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Vickie's chains rattled, and somewhere in the darkness of the corridor beyond her cell, wolves began to howl. Not aggressive sounds, but something else. Recognition, reverence, submission. An alpha had arrived. Not Thorn, something vastly more powerful. The holding cells stirred with activity. Warriors rushed past the barred doors, their voices sharp with urgency and anticipation. The younger warrior with kind eyes appeared, anxiety etched into the lines of his face. He stopped at Vickie's cell, key already in hand. "He wants to see you," the warrior said. "Now, before you're processed further, before the binding ceremony." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Binding ceremony. They meant to formalize her captivity, to make her official property of the pack through ritual and magic. "I'm not presentable," Vickie said, gesturing to her torn, blood-stained clothing, her unbathed skin, her wounds still seeping through their bandages. Surely the Alpha King would prefer. He's already waiting. The walk through the fortress corridors felt like moving through a dream. Warriors stood at attention as they passed, and Vickie realized with a start that they were standing for her. Not for her warrior escort, but for her specifically. Their eyes tracked her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. But it wasn't the hunger she'd expected. It was something more complicated. Curiosity, yes, but also something like awe. They emerged into a vast stone chamber open to the sky, where the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. The chamber had once been a natural canyon, Vickie realized, now fully enclosed by walls and arches, but still retaining that sense of geological immensity. At its center, standing before a simple stone throne, stood the Alpha King. Stanley was not what Vickie expected. She'd imagined power as something harsh, something that carved itself into sharp angles and demanding presence. But the Alpha King moved like water, all fluid grace and purposeful calm. He was tall, his shoulders carrying the muscular breadth of a warrior, his skin rich brown and marked with silver scars that seemed to tell stories of battles and triumphs. But his face was beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel, all sharp cheekbones and full lips and eyes so dark they absorbed light rather than reflected it. He was looking at her with an expression that made her stomach turn completely over. Recognition. Raw, soul-deep recognition. "Leave us," Stanley said, his voice like stone settling, like the earth acknowledging its own weight. Every warrior in the chamber obeyed without hesitation, vanishing into the shadows with the speed of trained soldiers. Within moments, Vickie and the Alpha King were alone. "What is your name?" he asked. Not "who are you," but "what is your name?" As though he needed to hear the specific truth of her identity from her own mouth. "Vickie," she whispered. "Vickie of the North Pack." No. He moved toward her with that liquid grace, and every instinct in her body screamed to back away, to fear, to protect herself. But she stood frozen as he stopped before her, towering over her by more than a foot, his dark eyes tracing every inch of her face as though reading sacred text. Not of the North Pack. Never truly of them. You belong to yourself, Vickie. You have always belonged to yourself. I'm wolfless, she said, the words coming out broken. I'm nothing. I'm less than nothing. You are fated, Stanley replied, and the words resonated through her chest with physical force. To me. You have been marked in my soul since the gods first drew breath, and I have searched for you through 3 winters of dreams that felt like dying. I have watched your face take shape in firelight and shadow. I have heard your name before you knew you had one worth hearing. That's impossible. Yes, Stanley agreed softly. Entirely impossible. The pack laws are explicit. Wolfless ones cannot bear fated bonds. The mystical connection requires 2 wolves, 2 souls that recognize each other through the shared language of the pack consciousness. He reached out and, with infinite gentleness, tilted her chin up so she had to meet his gaze. And yet, here you are. Here I am. And the bond between us burns like a forest fire, consuming everything it touches. He leaned down, bringing his face to the level of her own, and Vickie could smell him now, earth and stone, and something like wildfire, something that made her instinctively want to move closer rather than away. His eyes searched her face, as though looking for the dreams he'd accumulated, and she wondered if this was what it felt like to be seen. Truly seen. Your brother, Stanley said quietly, made a grave error in his calculations. He sold me, Vickie whispered. Yes, he sold his fated mate to a rival pack, not understanding that some connections transcend blood and pack politics. He traded away his greatest asset, not your body, not your utility, but your soul's perfect complement to his own pack's future. Stanley's expression hardened. Thorn will not have you. How will you stop him? You've no legal claim. I have more than a claim, Stanley interrupted, and when he spoke again, it was in the deep, resonant tone of power, the command voice of an alpha speaking absolute truth. I have you, Vickie of the North Pack. From this moment forward, you are under my protection, my guardianship, my mate bond in all ways that matter. And I will burn this entire world to ash before I allow anyone to claim what is mine. The chamber seemed to expand with the weight of his words, as though the stone itself was responding to the intensity of his declaration. Vickie understood, in that moment, that her life had just shattered into before and after. Everything before this instant belonged to a girl who was powerless and alone. Everything after belonged to someone new, someone claimed, protected, seen. For the first time in 19 winters, she was no longer invisible. The news of the Alpha King's sudden presence in the Western Territories spread through the fortress like wildfire. Vickie learned this not through direct communication, but through the quality of silence that followed Stanley's declaration, a silence so complete and reverent that she imagined she could hear the stone fortress breathing. She'd been moved from the holding cells to quarters befitting a mate of the king, a sprawling suite of rooms carved into the upper towers, with windows overlooking the forest canopy and stone walls painted with the pale silver of moonlight. The chambers were empty of personal belongings, but rich with potential, waiting to be filled. It was a space clearly designed for someone who would carry significance, someone of value. Vickie had immediately looked for the window's locks. Stanley had allowed her privacy to adjust, though he'd left warriors stationed outside her door. Protection, he'd called it, though Vickie understood the distinction between protection and surveillance was often merely one of perspective. She'd spent the first afternoon examining every surface, every crevice, looking for escape routes. The windows were too high. The doors led only to guarded corridors. She was still trapped. Only now the cage was gilded. On the second day, delegations began arriving at the fortress. Pack leaders from across the Western Territories, drawn by summons that none dared disobey. Vickie watched from her window as warriors bearing different-colored standards filed through the courtyard, their posture rigid with tension. Stanley was calling his council, establishing authority. Preparing. For war, she realized with a start. Ronan would never allow this. Her brother might have sold her without remorse, but losing her to a rival alpha would be a staggering blow to his pride. He would respond with force, would gather his own allies, would transform this from a pack dispute into something that could destabilize the entire region. Stanley wasn't simply claiming a mate. He was claiming the sister of the North Pack's alpha, creating a debt, a transgression, a conflict that would demand blood. She'd been the catalyst for something massive. That evening, Thorn came to her quarters. He stormed in without requesting entry, his scar luminous with rage, his massive frame filling the doorway like a storm front. Behind him came two of his warriors, flanking him in the tactical formation of dominant males. "The Alpha King takes liberties," Thorn said, his voice a low growl that spoke of barely contained violence. "He has no authority over territorial matters within my jurisdiction." Vickie stood from the window seat, her body tense. "I don't make the decisions regarding myself or my circumstances." "No," Thorn agreed, and smiled, an expression that held no warmth. "You don't. But Stanley seems to believe he does. He's declared you under his protection, which violates the contract signed between your brother and myself. That contract stipulates that you become property of the Western Pack, of me specifically, to be used as I see fit." The words made her skin crawl. She'd known this was coming, had understood, since Ronan signed the contract, that her body was now merchandise. But hearing it stated so explicitly, so casually, transformed fear into something sharper. Rage. "The Alpha King has superseding authority," she said quietly, drawing from the Pack lore she'd studied in the North Pack's archives. "An Alpha King's claim to a mate overrides territorial contracts. A claim to a mate is only valid if the claimed party is capable of bearing a true bond," Thorn snarled. "You're wolfless. You cannot be anyone's mate. This is a perversion of Pack law." The door behind him shattered. Not literally broke, though the wood splintered outward, as though struck by an invisible force. But the warriors outside scattered like leaves in a gale, and Stanley stepped through the ruin of the doorway with the casual grace of someone who'd never met a barrier he couldn't dismantle. He was in wolf form. Not entirely. His body remained mostly human, but his face had shifted to something between. His eyes burned to liquid gold, his teeth had sharpened to canines that caught the lamplight like mother of pearl. It was a form Vickie's limited knowledge suggested should be impossible, a state that most shifters could hold only briefly. Stanley maintained it like it cost him nothing. "My authority," he said, and his voice resonated with layers, the human words carrying beneath them the psychic weight of pure wolf, "supersedes everything in my territories. You will accept this, Thorn, or you will find your position restructured to reflect your lack of comprehension regarding hierarchy." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of one who'd never encountered resistance he couldn't overcome. Thorn's face went pale beneath the deeper tones of his skin, and Vickie watched as something ancient and primal flickered across his expression, the recognition of a predator facing one vastly more dangerous. "She is wolfless," Thorn tried again, but his voice had lost its certainty. She cannot. She is mine, Stanley interrupted. That is the only law that concerns me. She will remain in these quarters, under my protection, until such time as I determine otherwise. You will not approach her. You will not speak to her. You will not even think of her with anything other than absolute respect. Stanley's form shifted further, and though he remained mostly human, the wolf beneath the surface became almost visible, a massive shadow filling the room, a presence so overwhelming that Vickie found it difficult to breathe. Do you understand, Thorn? Yes. The word came out, cracked, diminished. Your obedience will be rewarded with continued authority over your territories. Your resistance will be rewarded with exile and death. Choose wisely. Thorn left without another word, dragging his warriors in his wake. The moment the door closed, Stanley's form stabilized, the wolf receding like a tide, leaving behind the appearance of a man, though his eyes remained gold, burning with an intensity that spoke of the predator barely contained beneath the surface. I've traumatized you, he said simply, a statement offered without apology. I'm used to violence, Vickie replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. I've lived with it every day of my life. This was different, but not traumatic. Stanley moved toward her with that liquid grace, and Vickie found she didn't step away. Your brother is already gathering armies, he said. The contract breach gives him legitimate grounds to declare war. There will be conflict, Vickie. There will be blood. I wanted to protect you from these realities, but you deserve the truth. Claiming you is the most difficult thing I've ever done, politically and diplomatically, and it's only the beginning. Why? She asked. Why claim me at all? You could have let this pass. You could have let me be. I could not, Stanley interrupted, and the words carried absolute certainty. Because to do so would be to deny the truth that's lived in my soul for 3 winters. You are not wolfless to me, Vickie. You are the other half of something that has always existed in the spaces between us. And no law, no custom, no political convenience will ever convince me to ignore that. He reached out and took her hand, gently, carefully, as though she was something infinitely precious and fragile. His skin was warm, and where they touched, Vickie felt something shift in her chest. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of something that might eventually become love. The forges of the Western Fortress burned day and night for the next week. Vickie discovered this through observation, through watching warriors carry lengths of glowing metal to hidden chambers, through hearing the rhythmic sound of hammers on anvils echo through stone corridors. Something was being made, something that required urgent completion. She pieced together fragments of overheard conversation and pack gossip, and understood, eventually, that Stanley was commissioning weapons, swords, spears, reinforced armor for battle. Her brother was coming. The knowledge sat heavy in her stomach, a stone she couldn't quite digest. Ronan would bring the North Pack's armies, would demand her return or accept combat as the price of Stanley's defiance. She'd been the catalyst for something that would destroy lives, would tear apart families and alliances. The thought made her physically ill. She found herself moving through the fortress with less resistance from the warriors. They'd recognized her status, had begun to show her the subtle deference reserved for the Alpha King's mate. It was disorienting, this sudden shift from invisible to invaluable. Vickie used the freedom it granted to explore, to map out the fortress, to understand the structure of the Pack's hierarchy and defenses. She also used it to escape. It happened on the 8th night after Stanley's dramatic assertion of ownership. Vickie waited until the late hours, when the fortress's activity diminished to skeleton crews managing watch rotations. She'd identified a service passage on the fortress's eastern side, one used by servants and lower-ranked warriors for movement between levels. It was less heavily guarded than the primary corridors, and at night it was often empty. She'd made it to the halfway point when she encountered him. The warrior was older, his dark hair shot through with silver, his face marked with ritual scars that spoke of decades of service. He stopped her with a gesture that held no aggression, only calm authority. "Going somewhere? Mate of the king?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the formality of his station. Vickie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. "I need to leave. I need to put distance between myself and the Alpha King before the war comes. I won't be the reason he dies." The warrior studied her for a long moment, and something flickered across his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding of something deeper. "Come with me," he said finally. "There's someone you should meet." He led her through passages she hadn't discovered on her own, deeper into the fortress's underbelly, past the chambers of warriors, and onto a path that seemed to descend toward the mountain's core. The air grew colder, heavier, pregnant with age and stone and something else, something like magic, though Vickie had no reference point for what magic actually felt like. They arrived at a cavern so vast that the far wall disappeared into darkness. The cavern's floor was covered in sand of a particular quality, not beach sand, but forge sand, the kind used to prevent metal from sticking during the casting process. And scattered across that sand, arranged in patterns Vickie recognized from old texts as ritual configurations, were weapons. But not new weapons being forged, ancient ones. Weapons that looked as though they'd been buried for centuries, preserved in the dry sand, waiting for reclamation. "The ancestors' legacy," the warrior said. "Weapons from the age of the great Alphas, when our kind first learned to forge their strength into metal, when they learned to channel the wolf's power through crafted objects, to make tools that could amplify a shifter's natural gifts." Vickie walked through the cavern slowly, her fingers trailing through the sand, and felt something shift in her chest. The objects here, swords, spears, ornaments, even jewelry, hummed with an energy that made her skin prickle. This was old magic, the kind that predated current pack lore, from an era when the world had been fiercer and stranger. "Why show me this?" she asked. "Because," the warrior said, and moved toward the cavern center, where a single object lay on a stone pedestal. "The king needs to see what you are capable of understanding. The king dreams of a future that requires more than politics and weapons and warrior strength." The object on the pedestal was a chain, but not a restraining chain like the silver that had burned her wrists. This chain was silver and gold intertwined, each link perfectly balanced, perfectly merged. As Vickie moved closer, she saw that the metal had been inscribed with symbols from an ancient script she recognized from her forbidden reading. The language of the earliest shifters, before the packs had stratified into their current hierarchies. "The chain of binding," the warrior said softly. "It was forged in the age of the great Alphas, when fated pairs were recognized as the foundation of pack strength. Legend says it was created to commemorate the first true mate bond, to transform the spiritual connection into something physical that could ground both partners in the most powerful moment of pack existence." Vickie lifted the chain, and it was lighter than she expected, warm to the touch. Why would this be buried? Why hide something so precious? "Because," the warrior said, "pack law forbids its use. The chain was created before the schism between wolfless and shifted bloodlines, before our kind decided that only the presence of a wolf made someone worthy of a true bond. When When our Alpha King saw you in his dreams, he understood that the old laws might still hold power, that the ancient magic might yet recognize what modern convention denies. The chain grew warm in her hands, and Vickie felt something stir in her chest. Not a wolf, she would never have that, but something else. A presence, an echo of power that recognized her as significant, as meaningful, as part of something vast and ancient and sacred. He means to bind with you, the warrior said. Not in the political sense, but truly, to take the fated connection and forge it into reality, to transform your bond from dream and instinct into something that will anchor him to the earth and anchor you to something beyond yourself. I'm wolfless, Vickie whispered, even as she held the chain, even as she felt its warmth, its recognition, its acknowledgement of her as something more than an empty vessel. I can't, you can, the warrior interrupted gently, because the chain doesn't require a wolf. It requires only two souls that recognize each other as home. The chain will do the rest. That night, Vickie didn't run. She returned to her quarters with the chain hidden beneath her clothing, warm against her heart. And when Stanley entered hours later, she showed him what she'd found. He knelt before her when she placed it in his hands, his expression something between reverence and overwhelming tenderness. "Will you?" he asked, and the question held everything, his hopes, his dreams, his willingness to reshape the entire world, if that was what her happiness demanded. Vickie took a breath that felt like the first truly free breath she'd ever drawn. "Yes," she said. The armies of the North Pack came like a storm front, visible from the fortress's highest towers as a mass of movement through the forest, a crushing force intent on reclamation and retribution. Ronan had gathered 20,000 warriors, an extraordinary mobilization that spoke to the desperation of his pride. He'd been humiliated, his authority challenged, and he would accept nothing short of total vindication. Vickie watched from the tower's edge as Stanley's forces assembled in the courtyard below, warriors moving with the fluid coordination of a military trained for generations of conflict. The Alpha King stood at their center, his form flickering between human and wolf as his power resonated through the gathered crowds, a visible reminder of the ancient strength he commanded. The morning of the confrontation, Stanley came to Vickie's quarters before the battle's first light. He was fully transformed, his massive wolf form requiring him to enter through a modified archway specifically built for such transitions. He shifted partially, maintaining enough human form to speak, though his face held the sharp lines of the predator. His eyes burned to gold. "I will not ask you to do this," he said. "But your presence at the boundary, your choice to stand with me rather than return to your brother, would break his will more completely than any weapon ever could." "You want me to witness the war I've caused?" Vickie said, not without understanding. "You want me to see the violence my existence demands?" "No," Stanley corrected, and his tone held absolute certainty. "I want you to understand that you are not the cause of this. Your brother is. His pride, his refusal to accept that you are infinitely more valuable than his ego, his willingness to traffic in human life to serve his ambitions, these are the causes. You are the catalyst that forced him to finally face the consequences of his cruelty." The chain lay around Vickie's neck beneath her clothing, warm and familiar now, a constant reminder of the shift that had occurred within her. She'd spent her entire life convinced that her wolflessness made her less than, that her lack of transformation rendered her insubstantial. But the chain's presence, the way Stanley's power seemed to wrap around her like a cloak of protection, had begun to suggest another possibility. That she'd been complete all along, that her humanity was not a deficiency, but a different kind of strength. She dressed in clothing befitting a mate of the Alpha King, deep blue and silver, colors that marked her as belonging to Stanley's house, and followed him to the boundary between the fortress and the neutral ground where the parley would occur. The sun rose pale and uncertain, as though even the heavens were hesitant about what was about to unfold. Ronan arrived with the arrogance of a man convinced of his rightness. He was larger than Vickie remembered, his body transformed by winters of Pack Alpha authority into something more predator than human. He shifted only partially, maintaining enough human form to speak. His bearing carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd never questioned his own righteousness. When he saw Vickie standing beside Stanley, his expression transformed into something almost unrecognizable. "You can't want this," he said to her, ignoring the Alpha King entirely. "You can't want to belong to him. He's the enemy, Vickie. He is the reason our pack has suffered." "Our pack?" Vickie's voice came out steady, controlled, containing none of the fear she'd expected to feel in this moment. "I have never been part of our pack, brother. I was an embarrassment you tolerated, a wolfless shame you traded like livestock the moment it served your interests. I owe you nothing. No loyalty, no sacrifice, no silence about the things you've done to me." "You're confused," Ronan snarled. "The Alpha King has manipulated you." "No." Vickie stepped forward, and Stanley moved with her, his massive wolf form a shadow at her back, but he allowed her this moment. "I have never been clearer. You taught me that I was worthless because I couldn't transform. You taught me that my humanity was a deficiency. But this man," she gestured to Stanley, "has shown me that the opposite might be true. That what I am might be valuable precisely because it's different, because it exists outside the narrow framework of your power structures." Ronan's face reddened with rage. "I will have you back. I will teach you the price of betrayal." "You will accept that you lost," Vickie interrupted, and she heard the Alpha King's power resonating in her own voice now, the chain at her throat humming in harmony with it. "You will accept that I am no longer yours, that I never truly was. And if you continue this conflict, my mate will destroy your forces, and you will die knowing that your own cruelty created the instrument of your destruction." For a moment, there was only silence. The Northpack's warriors had heard her, had understood that they were following a leader, consumed by a vanity that would lead them only to death. Vickie felt the hesitation ripple through their ranks, the subtle shift in morale that came from realizing that victory was impossible. Ronan saw it too. She watched the moment when the illusion of control shattered behind his eyes, watched understanding dawn that his pride had led him to a precipice from which there was no recovery. For just an instant, she saw something in his expression that might have been regret. Then that moment passed, replaced with rage so complete that it seemed to consume him entirely. He transformed fully, his body expanding into the massive form of a wolf, and launched toward Vickie with the express intent of silencing her permanently. It was the action of a man who no longer cared about victory or survival, only about ensuring that his sister would not exist to testify to his failure. Stanley moved between them in the space of a heartbeat. The collision of two alphas in their wolf forms created a shockwave that knocked warriors from their feet, that cracked stone in the fortress walls, that sent birds fleeing from the surrounding forest in a chaos of wings and cries. Ronan fought with the fury of a man burning from inside out, all desperation and destructive power, while Stanley fought with the calm efficiency of someone who'd faced infinitely more dangerous opponents. It ended in moments. Ronan's body broken, his will shattered, his life bleeding out onto the neutral ground where honor had once mattered. Stanley stood over his corpse in wolf form, breathing heavily, and then transformed back to something more human, his naked form marked with blood that belonged to others, his expression empty of triumph. The North Pack's remaining warriors watched as their alpha's body went still. There was no shame in retreating now, no honor in continuing. One by one they turned and began making their way back to their territories, following the chain of command to whatever successor would emerge from the ashes of Ronan's pride. Vickie walked to where her brother's body lay, and she looked at his face, still bearing the marks of the man who'd raised her, tormented her, sold her, and felt almost nothing. The connection between them had been severed long before this moment. His death was merely the confirmation of a loss that had already occurred. Stanley wrapped his human form in a cloak and moved to her side. He didn't touch her, understanding that this moment belonged to her alone, that she needed space to process the finality of severing the last connection to her former life. "I'm not sorry," she said finally. "No," Stanley agreed. "You're free." The binding ceremony took place 3 days after Ronan's death, once the fortress had been cleared of wounded and the territory had been secured under Stanley's undisputed authority. The preparation was extensive. Ritual baths infused with herbs that made Vickie's skin tingle with sensation. The application of ceremonial marks in ink and ash that traced the constellations along her shoulders and chest. The braiding of her hair with threads of silver and gold. The healer who'd first spoken to her of the fated connection came to help with the preparations. She moved with the reverence of someone who understood the magnitude of what was about to occur, her pale eyes bright with something like joy. "In the old texts," the healer said, carefully threading silver through a braid of Vickie's dark hair, "there are stories of the first true mate bonds. They say the connection was so powerful that it transformed the partners, made them more than they had been individually. The wolfless ones were said to gain the strength of stone and earth, while the wolves gained the flexibility and wisdom that comes from existing in multiple forms." "Are they just stories?" Vickie asked. "Everything is a story until it is lived," the healer replied. "After that, it's simply truth." The ceremony took place in the cavern, where Vickie had found the chain, a space that had been transformed by preparation and ritual into something cathedral-like, something sacred. The ancient weapons had been arranged in concentric circles, and torches burned at precise intervals, casting flickering light that made the shadows dance like living things. Stanley stood at the center, fully transformed into his wolf form. But when Vickie entered, he shifted into something between human torso, but with the wolf's face, the wolf's eyes, the wolf's powerful frame. It was beautiful and terrible, a form that spoke of his complete rejection of the pack's conventional boundaries. She approached him slowly, and with each step, she felt the chain at her throat warm further. It was responding to something, resonating with an energy that seemed to flow from Stanley himself, a power that had nothing to do with command or dominance, and everything to do with recognition, with home. When they touched, Vickie felt the world shift. It was not painful, as she'd feared binding might be. It was expansive, as though her consciousness suddenly stretched beyond the confines of her skull to encompass something vast and terrible and beautiful. She could sense the fortress around them, as though it was part of her own body, could feel the presence of every warrior within its walls, could perceive the forest beyond with a clarity that went far beyond normal human senses. But more than that, she could feel Stanley, not as an external presence, but as a fundamental part of her own awareness. His joy at being bound to her moved through her like sunlight. His hope for their future intertwined with hers until it was impossible to distinguish where he ended and she began. The chain around her neck began to glow, the silver and gold blazing with a light that seemed to come from within rather than without. The light expanded, filling the cavern, and Vickie understood that she was witnessing something extraordinary, the moment when ancient magic acknowledged a bond that conventional law denied. Stanley's wolf form wrapped around her human one, and when she looked down at her own body, she saw that marks had appeared on her skin, symbols matching those on his form, patterns that linked them together, that declared to the world that she was no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer defined by what she lacked. She was claimed. She was loved. She was home. When the light faded, they remained entwined, and Vickie felt the chain's warmth settle into something permanent, not burning anymore, but present, real, fundamental to her existence. She could breathe now in a way she'd never been able to before. She could exist without the constant low-level panic that had defined her entire life. The pack's warriors filed into the cavern afterward, and as was tradition, they approached to offer their acknowledgement of the new mate bond. One by one, they came before Vickie, and instead of the judgment she'd expected, she saw only acceptance. They'd watched her stand before her brother without fear. They'd watched her claim her own power, her own voice. To them, she'd already proven her worth. The fortress underwent subtle shifts in the weeks after the binding. Vickie found herself inhabiting spaces that had previously been closed to her. The War Council chamber, where Stanley's advisors gathered to discuss territory and alliances. The library, where she could read without restriction, where the knowledge she'd stolen in secret was now rightfully hers to access. The training grounds, where she watched wolves transform and fight and celebrate the predatory power that lived in their blood. She remained human. The binding had changed many things, but it hadn't granted her the ability to shift. The chain at her throat acknowledged that she didn't need to change to be whole. Her humanity was accepted, integrated, celebrated as part of what made her valuable to her mate and her new pack. One afternoon, approximately 2 months after the binding, Vickie found herself walking through the fortress gardens, stone terraces that overlooked the forest, where she'd begun cultivating growing things. It was here that she and Stanley had fallen into a rhythm of meeting, a quiet time when the weight of his position as Alpha King lifted enough for him to simply be present with her. He found her there, as he always did, moving with that liquid grace that still sometimes caught her breath. He wore only loose trousers, his chest marked with new scars from minor territorial disputes, small conflicts that arose constantly among packs, testing his boundaries. Each scar was a story she could read through the bond they shared, understanding not just the physical injury, but the emotional weight, the decisions that had led to violence, the moments of doubt and certainty that had defined his choices. "I've been thinking," he said, settling beside her on the stone wall she'd been using to observe her gardens, "about what you might want for your future." "I thought my future was here," Vickie replied, though without any questioning edge. The statement was true, but it was also incomplete. "It is," Stanley confirmed. "But I was wolfless in a way, too, before I found you. I had power and position, but I had no direction for it beyond survival and strength. The dreams I had of you seemed to suggest something else, a future where strength could be directed toward building something rather than merely protecting it." He paused, and she felt his uncertainty through the bond, the genuine doubt of a man trying to imagine possibilities that were unprecedented. "I want to change the pack laws, Vickie. I want to formally recognize that wolfless ones can carry fated bonds, can be full members of the pack hierarchy, can exist not as deficiencies, but as complementary forces. I want to transform what we are into something better." "That will make you enemies," Vickie said, understanding the implications clearly. "Other packs won't accept such radical changes. They'll see it as weakness." "Yes," Stanley agreed. "But I've found that true strength often looks like weakness to those still bound by old power structures. And I'm willing to be misunderstood if it means creating a world where another girl like you never has to spend winters believing herself worthless." Vickie felt the truth of his conviction through their bond, and it resonated with something deep inside her. She thought of all the ways she'd been diminished, all the moments she'd been told she was less than, and understood that his mission was also her mission. Their bond wasn't just personal, it was revolutionary. "I'll help you," she said, "though I don't know what use a wolfless human can be in political negotiations." "You are invaluable precisely because you exist as living proof that the laws are wrong," Stanley interrupted. "You are here. You are bound to me. You are recognized by the ancient magic itself as worthy. That is far more powerful than any words I could speak." Over the following months, Vickie found herself transformed from captive to advisor. She attended council meetings, not as a silent ornament, but as a voice that contributed to decisions about pack policy and territorial management. She wrote documents that would eventually become part of the foundational texts for reformed pack law, and spoke before packs that had gathered to hear the Alpha King's new vision. The chain around her throat became iconic, a symbol recognized across territories as the mark of the fated bond that defied convention. Other wolfless individuals began appearing at Stanley's fortress, drawn by rumors of protection and acceptance. Vickie helped establish a school where they could learn the histories and traditions of their packs without shame, where their humanity was treated as strength rather than failure. It was quiet work, less dramatic than battles and political conquests, but it was work that felt sacred. One evening, 9 months after the binding, Vickie sat in her garden as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. She was alone. Stanley was in council, dealing with some dispute between minor territories, and she found herself reflecting on the distance she'd traveled from that girl in chains, being transported to an enemy pack. The chain around her throat had transformed from symbol of constraint to symbol of connection. It was still silver and gold, still inscribed with ancient symbols, still warm to the touch. But now, when she held it, she felt not trapped, but anchored, held not by force, but by love, by recognition, by the simple truth that she was wanted, valued, seen. She plucked a flower from one of her gardens, a deep blue bloom she'd cultivated specifically because its color matched Stanley's house, and turned it slowly in her fingers, watching the light play across its petals. This small, perfect thing had grown from her care and attention. She had created something beautiful in a place designed for beauty. The fortress behind her hummed with the presence of her pack, warriors training, servants moving through corridors, the endless machinery of a society she was helping to reshape. And somewhere in those stone corridors, Stanley was thinking of her. She knew. She could feel his awareness through their bond, a constant, gentle presence, reminding her that she was never truly alone. For the first time in her life, Vickie understood what it meant to belong. 3 winters after the binding, Vickie stood on the highest tower of the fortress, watching snow fall across the Blackthorn Mountains. The landscape was transformed by winter's touch, all white and pale grey, the forest reduced to skeletal branches that held the snow like offerings. It was beautiful in the way that harsh places could be beautiful, demanding and unforgiving, but honest in its severity. She wore heavier clothing now, deep blue lined with silver fur, and the chain around her throat had been joined by others, symbols of the various councils and packs she'd become advisor to, markers of her journey from invisible to indispensable. At her side hung a sword, not one of the ancient ones from the cavern, but one she'd commissioned specifically, silver and gold, entwined in the blade itself, shaped to her hand, balanced for her human strength rather than for wolf power. She'd learned to fight, not with a wolf's ferocity or an alpha's command voice, but with the precision and strategy that came from lacking physical dominance and having to rely instead on intelligence and foresight. She'd become dangerous in a way that surprised even her, not because she was strong, but because she was creative in finding ways to overcome strength with cleverness. Footsteps announced Stanley's arrival, and she didn't turn as he approached, knowing the particular quality of his presence, the way she knew her own heartbeat. He moved to stand beside her, and she felt the comfort of his proximity like a warm cloak settling around her shoulders. "The North Pack's new Alpha has agreed to preliminary discussions," he said, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone updating his equal rather than his mate. This was one of the gifts their bond had provided, the ability to exist together without performance, without hierarchy. He's young, open-minded. I think he might be receptive to the reformed laws. "Ronan's youngest brother?" Vickie asked, and felt Stanley's confirmation through their bond. "Yes. He saw what happened to your former mate bond, and it's made him cautious about old traditions." Stanley paused. "He asked about you specifically, expressed interest in meeting the wolfless mate of the Alpha King." "Should I be honored or concerned?" Vickie asked, managing a small smile. "Honored," Stanley said firmly. "You've become a symbol, Vickie. You represent the possibility that the old laws were wrong, that we can imagine a different future. Your existence contradicts every piece of conventional wisdom the packs were built on." She leaned into his side, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, a gesture of complete ease and familiarity. Through the bond, she felt his contentment, his sense of purpose, his absolute certainty that they'd chosen the right path. The fortress below them showed signs of the changes she'd helped initiate. The holding cells had been transformed into housing for the wolfless members of the pack, individuals who were no longer treated as servants or property, but as integral members of pack structure. The Great Hall, once a space of hierarchical dining where rank determined seating, now hosted open councils where any pack member could voice concerns or grievances. It was slower than either of them would have liked. Change was always sluggish when it contradicted centuries of tradition, but it was happening. The Northern Territories still held to the old ways, but Stanley's reformations in the Western lands had begun to inspire mimicry in other regions. Every winter brought more packs, questioning the restrictions they'd maintained for generations. "I've been having the dreams again," Stanley said quietly, and Vickie's attention sharpened. He meant the dreams that had drawn them together in the first place, the visions that had announced her to him across years and distance. "But they're different now. Instead of searching for your face, I'm seeing forward. I'm seeing futures we might choose together." "What do you see?" she asked, though she could sense the general shape of his visions through their bond. Possibilities rather than certainties, potential rather than prophecy. "Children," Stanley said. "Some who shift, some who don't. A pack that's stronger because it's integrated different kinds of strength. A world where your future descendants won't have to hide the parts of themselves that don't match conventional definition." Vickie felt tears prick her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were from grief or joy. The thought of children, of creating life with Stanley, of raising them in a world she was actively reshaping to be kinder than the one she'd survived, was overwhelming in its magnitude. "I was sold like livestock," she whispered. "And now you're talking about building a dynasty with me." "You were never livestock," Stanley said, and turned her to face him directly. "You were always a queen. You just needed someone to help you see it." He kissed her then, and through their bond, she felt the depth of his conviction, the absolute certainty that her value went far beyond what she could offer him. She was valuable because she was herself, because she was intelligent and brave and stubborn and creative and fundamentally, irreplaceably herself. The chain around her throat hummed with warmth, and Vickie understood that it would never stop being warm. It would never stop being a reminder that she was held not by force, but by love. Not by obligation, but by choice. Not by power, but by connection. She was home. And somewhere in the future, a girl born without a wolf. Born to a pack that tried to diminish her. Born to a world that said she was worthless. That girl would look at Vickie and understand that being wolfless didn't mean being powerless. That the things that made her different were the things that made her dangerous. That the love of an alpha king and the support of a pack willing to change could transform the most devastating curse into the most precious blessing. The snow fell around them, and the fortress stood solid and real and possible beneath the white sky. And Vickie, no longer the girl who'd been sold, no longer the woman who'd been invisible, stood at the center of everything, marked by her chain, held by her bond, home at last. The story you've just read is more than a tale of love conquering tradition. It's a revolution whispered in silver and gold. Vickie's journey from invisible to invaluable isn't just fantasy. It's a mirror for anyone who's ever been told their difference makes them less. In a world obsessed with power and dominance, she discovered that true strength lives in refusing to shrink. Stanley's dream of a reformed pack system isn't just romance. It's a radical reimagining of what community could be if we honored every member, not just those born into predetermined hierarchies. Their bond challenges everything we thought we knew about worth, belonging, and the transformative power of being truly seen. If you felt the weight of Vickie's chains and the warmth of her freedom, if you recognized yourself in her struggle for recognition, if you believe in the revolutionary power of love and reform, then this story belongs to you. Share it with someone who needs to know they are not invisible. Subscribe to stay immersed in worlds where the outcasts become the revolution. Comment with your own story of transformation, your own journey from diminishment to devotion, your own discovery of worth. Together, we're rewriting the laws that bind us. Together, we're proving that being different isn't a curse, it's the beginning of everything.